Well, hello, everybody. Today we have a returning guest with us, Tim Schroeder, who is the CEO of CTI, Clinical Trial Services, here in Covington, Kentucky, and serving the greater Cincinnati area. Tim, thanks so much for visiting us again and talking to us about this, all the impacts of COVID in your business and what you're seeing around the country.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to come back, Kris. I think it's been maybe about 3 months since you and I talked, and I know you've launched almost weekly these conversations with leaders across the region, so I appreciate the chance to be part of it again.
Absolutely. And, you know, you have really helped clarify a lot of the topics all around COVID and the issue of this pandemic for the community. And you've kind of broken it out for a lot of us in this idea of topics of testing, of treatment, and then, of course, vaccine. So maybe if you could just update us on what you're seeing as we sit here at the end of July, as to tell us what you see in terms of the testing across the country and our community.
Sure. I think what we've seen is an evolution on the testing side. You know, there still is this high level of interest in, I don't feel very well, is this COVID-19? In which case you get the swab, generally of the nasopharyngeal cavity, where they stick a swab up your nose, and they test it to see if there is actually, via a technology like PCR, to see whether there's active antigens reflecting that you are acutely infected with the virus. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other major part of testing is what's called antibody testing, where we actually look in a person's blood to see whether or not their immune system has made antibodies against COVID-19, suggesting that they have previously been exposed to it and have mounted a response against it. If you think about those two types of tests, say 3 months ago when we were talking, the antibody testing was pretty much in its infancy, and the antigen or PCR testing was it was available, but the supply and the demand were very much imbalanced. I think what we've seen over the last 3 months is a tremendous increase in the amount of testing being done, but unfortunately, we've also seen a similar rise in the demand for tests. So I think some of the things, Kris, that are coming up, you know, as you hear people saying, it's taking a long time to get my test result back, and that's, I think, a fair criticism, is we are hearing in some cases 5 to 10 days for a test to come back, in which case, if the question is, am I infected and is there a possibility I could be contagious and give it to someone else? Obviously, if it takes a week to get a result back, that's probably too late to really impact your behavior. So in some ways, if you don't feel well, even if you don't have a test result back, you probably need to self-quarantine, stay at home, stay well hydrated, and wait for that test to come back. I think the other thing as part of the testing has been, we know that these tests are not 100% accurate. There can be what are called false positives, where a test says you're positive, but in fact you are negative on tests that are done subsequently. We've seen that in a few of the professional athletes. I think it's been highly visible recently. And then we've also seen the case of what they consider to be false negatives, where in fact the test comes back negative, but in fact the person is in fact infected. That could be a combination of a couple things. Could be that the test isn't completely accurate, or more likely it may be that the sample wasn't collected properly, or it could be that you just aren't actually shedding enough virus at that particular time to actually be collected and to show that in fact you're positive. So by no means are these things 100% accurate, and in fact a single test is a snapshot in time. The better way to assess somebody is actually to be able to test them serially over multiple days, but we know that that's virtually impossible for people like ourselves to be able to do. It might be possible for somebody in the NBA who's in a bubble where they've procured a lot of tests, but those are some of the limitations on the testing right now, Kris.
And so I also hear you saying that if somebody actually is symptomatic, and if they want to be tested, this is also speaks to the issue of making sure someone waits a few days, probably, because if that 2-3 days gives them a better chance of having a more accurate test when they do get the test.
Yeah, it's a good point you raise, is there's a spectrum of when you develop symptoms. I feel a little bad, I feel more, really bad. The question is, when does that test actually correlate with your symptoms? And while there's a lot of research going on, I think there's clearly some evidence that suggests there's not a direct correlation between a positive test and your symptoms. We've heard people say that they've had repeated negatives, still had the symptoms, and we've had other people say, I really was asymptomatic, but had a positive test come back. So in some ways, I tell people it's almost, I think as time has gone on, you treat this more and more like influenza, which is during the influenza virus season, typically if you feel bad, if you have a fever, nauseated, just don't, muscle aches, pains, things like that, usually what you do is you stay home. And generally you run a fever, so then you take maybe some things for the fever like a Motrin or Advil or Tylenol, and you take a lot of fluid to be hydrated. And if you don't feel like you're getting better, that's usually when you go to your family physician, and he or she then generally will do a rapid test for the influenza virus, tell you if you're positive or not. That's sort of the same type of situation now, and I think one of the things are people are so much more cognizant about COVID-19. I think that most of the physicians in the research centers we're talking to say that they're seeing patients much earlier in the treatment. They're less ill than they were 3 or 4 months ago, and as a result, most of them do not have to be hospitalized. They can be treated at home, except for the worst cases. So I think that's the good news about both the diagnostic and the treatment paradigm today. Is we're getting healthier people, generally, younger, healthier people being infected. They don't have as bad of symptoms, and they generally don't require to be hospitalized like we were seeing in February and March.
So speak to the treatment side of things from what you're seeing then. They are healthier potentially. More about the type of treatments that would be available, whether or not someone's treating at home. And if they are admitted, that those treatments are actually, some of the treatments are actually working. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, we've had a chance, Kris, up close and personal. And before I leave the diagnostic side, just real quickly, I do want to say we've been really fortunate here, I think, in the region because we've got some of the best testing facilities. So in some ways, when we read or listen to the media nationally or internationally, and you hear about these testing voids, I would argue with the combination of the hospital laboratories in the greater Cincinnati, northern Kentucky area, as well as the commercial labs, the PPDs, the gravity diagnostics, the MedPaces, I think actually our turnaround time is a lot better than average. So in some ways, while there are still some delays, we've seen some really great services here locally. But to your point on the treatment side, yeah, we've been fortunate at CTI that we have more than 20 treatment studies that we've been part of starting as early as 4 or 5 months ago. And they run the gamut from really critically ill patients that are in the ICU, on a ventilator, struggling to survive, all the way back, if you can think of the whole spectrum, to people who have been exposed to the virus but have no symptoms whatsoever. So if you think about healthcare workers in the emergency room, in the ICU, if you think about first responders, paramedics, EMTs, police, fire, they have these exposures as well. So we've been fortunate that we've got a whole spectrum of those treatment studies. Many of those studies have enrolled significant number of patients. We've actually had the chance to even analyze some of the results and publish some of the results already. A few of the early treatments are already approved under emergency use authorizations by the FDA. So in fact, if you go to a hospital and have a progressing set of symptoms related to COVID, there's a pretty good chance you might get a drug called remdesivir, which is a Gilead drug, which has been shown to reduce hospitalizations by up to 5 days. Also, just as simple as corticosteroids, which are very old drugs that are prescribed for many, many disorders, including autoimmune diseases, anti-inflammatory agents, things like that. But there's some very strong data coming out of big studies showing that even a single dose or a couple doses of corticosteroids in the moderately severe population can markedly reduce their time in the hospital and improve their survival. So the good news is we've got some of those drugs already approved. Then we've got some other ones that are getting closer to approval where we're seeing significant benefits. Excuse me, a couple of the studies we've been involved in, we've been actually able to publish data already and show results where it appears that some of these are actually decreasing hospital stay, decreasing time in the intensive care unit, even decreasing time on ventilators. And some of these have had patients as old as 90 years old or older participating in the studies. So the good news is the people who seem to be at the highest risk are being studied and being shown to have benefits from some of these treatments. And essentially the FDA is approving or reviewing these approvals almost as they're being submitted in real time. So I suspect with each passing week and month, the physicians, the nurses, and the pharmacists will have additional treatments available to them that hopefully we will continue to reduce the mortality associated with this virus and even reduce the hospitalizations associated with it.
Well, that's just fantastic news, really, and very hopeful overall. Maybe we jump right into this the other area of your expertise, which is vaccines. And you've been working with thousands of participants, I think, and ramping that whole process up. But we're hearing nationally about these new vaccines coming online and the testing. Maybe speak to what you're seeing happening on a day-by-day basis there.
Yeah, the excitement, I think, over the last 3 to 4 months, and when you think in terms of the impact that this virus has had on the economy, not to mention the healthcare, but just the economy, and I think even the social environment, that people, are looking for. If we get a vaccine, will that allow us to return to a more natural or normal, lifestyle? And I think the short answer to that is yes. And I think the good news is there's a lot of optimism with each passing, week or month. We have more than 100 vaccines that are under development. The first 10 or so have actually been used in patients, healthy volunteers. They have all been shown to work so far. So a lot of times people say, what's your level of optimism? One, for a vaccine being approved, and then two, when. And I think what we've seen over the last, say, 90 days is a lot more enthusiasm that we believe that there will be one or more that are approved and demonstrated to be safe and efficacious, basically meaning they will cause you as a recipient of the vaccine to mount an immune response that will protect you from the virus. The first 5 or 6 have already now published and presented their results, and they look quite promising. That group of companies is now moving to the late stages of studies, and another group of a dozen or so companies are moving to the early stages. So the good news is we've not put our proverbial eggs all in one basket. There are a lot of vaccines that are looking promising. At the same time, the concern is if you do demonstrate a vaccine works and the FDA and other regulatory authorities approve it, how long will it take till I can get vaccinated, meaning the general population? And I think the answer there is through a combination of efforts on the private sector and the public sector. Many of these biotechnology companies and pharmaceutical companies are going at risk, and they're manufacturing hundreds of millions of doses of these vaccines, not knowing if they are truly going to get approved, which is typically not the way you do things. You usually hedge your bets, you wait till the approval comes, then you start manufacturing. So the good news is, and I want to spend a little bit more time about some of the work we're specifically doing, but the good news is that if you look at some of the lead candidates, is already they are being manufactured and stored to be able to be rolled out as soon as the data shows that they're safe and efficacious, as soon as the FDA and others give the approval. So I think the gap has been shrunk quite a bit. I think that many people are optimistic that literally before the end of the calendar year, there's a pretty good chance that we'll have emergency use approvals and be able to start treating tens of millions of patients, healthy volunteers, high-risk individuals, here in the U.S. and other places around the world. So I think all that should make people feel a lot more optimistic that we're not that far away, and that, a combination of the science world and the business world has come together to really move something at a time speed that's just totally unprecedented.
That's unbelievable. And I tell you, speak to the Tim, to your mindset, with this great news you're sharing with us. Balance that with the general. So there's a lot of fear out there that people have that said, hey, let's just keep everything locked down because we do not want to have any more infections. We don't want to put a strain on the healthcare system. How does that get balanced with the information you're seeing in terms of vaccines coming out, better treatments? How does that get balanced in your mind? I know you can't speak. It becomes a little bit of a murky world to give your opinion there, but help me understand how you balance that in terms of how we get through this next 6 months.
Well, I think the thing is, Kris, we know a lot more about the virus than we knew, for instance, when you and I talked 3 months ago. I mean, I remember coming into our office in the early days of the pandemic, and I literally didn't touch railings. I didn't touch buttons in elevators. because it was concerned we did not know how this virus is spread. I think now there's been some tremendous research done across the globe that suggests this is primarily an aerosolized airborne spread virus. And that's one of the reasons something as simple as both of us wearing masks, if we're together, reduces the transmission so significantly. So I think to your point, I think, there clearly are prudent behaviors, and then there are behaviors which are probably unwarranted. I think that if you look at our healthcare workers as the number one priority, 3, 4, 5 months ago, we did not have enough protective equipment. We didn't have the right protective equipment. And unfortunately, we were seeing nurses and physicians, frontline workers being infected, critically ill, and in many cases, someone unfortunately died. I think that the better practices, the better protective equipment has given a much stronger comfort level to those responders being able to say, I can do my job, I can't be careless, and nothing is 100%, but we really have, as much as we know about the virus and where we stand today, I can effectively treat people and not feel like I'm putting myself or my family at risk. I think to your question, if you think about how you keep the economy going, whether you're, working at a Schroeder's or you're working in an Amazon warehouse or you're in a CTI research center, there clearly are very essential businesses, and then there's ones that are sort of essential, and then there's ones that are not essential. And far be it for me, I welcome people like yourself that can help try to guide us as to which ones fall into which categories. But I do think is we are seeing one, stronger research data which helps guide the policies and the principles. Two, I do think we're seeing better adoption, whether it's you're mandated to do it by government or by businesses, than we were seeing a few months ago. And hopefully this recent flare-up that we've seen in our region and the more severe ones we've seen in the southeast and the southwest, hopefully those will start to flatten out. And I'm not saying we go back to normal business, but at least we go back to some level of normalcy as we fight through, getting the better treatments and the better, getting the vaccines out there, to prevent this as much as possible.
And it seems pretty clear to me that we've benefited in greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky by not living in an overly dense community, that we've been able to kind of get past a lot of these huge spikes. When you look across, whether it be because of travel, because of very dense living conditions, potentially very dense working conditions that across in other parts of the country, they've got a challenge that we are just not going to have to deal with, thank God. But at the same time, we can learn from them and realize that, as you talked about it, this being an aerosolized transmission, that if we're not that close and we're masking, and while balancing the fact that these treatments are available coming down the line in future vaccines, we can get through this in a much healthier way while keeping hopefully most of the economy open and functioning.
Well, to give you an example, you hit the nail on the head, Kris. Like, we have associates in 40 countries. Earlier today I was in a call with our Brazilian colleagues because we've got several studies we're doing in Brazil. If you think of Sao Paulo, more than 20 million people in Sao Paulo. And if you're in the center city, you might confuse the center city with Manhattan. It is contemporary, it is modernized, it has the highest level of healthcare, of hygiene, et cetera. But when you go away from that into some of the poor areas, and you think about a virus like COVID-19 in a pandemic-like situation, is you have multiple generations living in unfortunately, very, very poor hygiene. And so, it's heartbreaking when you think in terms of the thousands, if not higher numbers of people there, unfortunately, that are getting infected without access to health care, who likely are not going to have the outcomes that we're going to have here. So you're right. I think density plays a huge role. I think healthcare systems play a huge role. And obviously access to healthcare and hygiene, also go a long way to minimizing the spread of a virus like this.
Tim, your insights invaluable, and I think it is just so spot on and very clear, by the way. If there was any key takeaway as we wrap this up, is there one mindset that you'd like to share with those in Northern Kentucky about, any other takeaway that you would like to present?
Well, I think the one thing, Kris, I would just like to highlight is we got the great news last week that we have been awarded participation in the largest phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine study, and I don't have it under contract to let me disclose the company, but it's one of the 5 biggest companies in the world, in the pharma world, if it gives you a sense. It'll be 60,000 healthy volunteers that are going to be treated across North America and Europe and Asia. We've actually committed to enrolling and treating 2,000 subjects just for that one study here in Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, which is a huge endeavor. It's going to be over about 8 weeks, probably going to start at the end of August, and this data will be the data that will get this vaccine approved or not. And so we're going to continue to pitch. As you know, we've had this campaign to sign 10,000 local folks up to participate in multiple studies, and at the same time, University of Cincinnati has done a great job. They've got a large study. Cincinnati Children's has a large study, and so I just encourage everybody who sees this video or who talks to any of us, if you go to our website, it'll direct you, ctifacts.com, or you can go to our phone number, which is 513-721-3868, and they'll just take your preliminary information, no commitment on your side other than to learn more, but we're trying as much as possible. We've used the example of Albert Sabin developing the first polio vaccine here in the region more than 50 years ago, is to say we really want the region, to play a big role, not just for ourselves, but for the world as a whole. And so almost everybody will have an opportunity to participate. The initial part of this large 60,000 subject study will be people between the ages of 18 and 55, but then once we treat them, we'll enroll 55 to 80, and then ultimately we will swing back and have some children and some adolescents, and we'll also be able to include people at high risk. So it will not just be healthy individuals, it will be people with compromised immune system, people that have been exposed to the virus because of their workplace, et cetera. So, would just encourage anybody who has any level of interest, either call, go to the website, any contact, and we'll start to answer your questions. And, like I said, I think it's an honor and a privilege that we can be part of this as a company and as a region, and the teamwork to make sure that we can try and be part of delivering one of these vaccines across the finish line.
Well, it's an exciting, but in some ways a scary time, and thank God there's organizations like yours and you leading it that can help work through this. And we appreciate everything you do, and we were so glad to be you're such a key corporate partner in Greater Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. Really appreciate the time, Tim.
Well, thanks for having me, Kris, and thanks for your support. As you modestly wouldn't say, but you were a huge part of us relocating to these corporate headquarters now more than 3 years ago. So we're very grateful for that.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good rest of the day.